say this is
Right. This is Jack Lindsay continuing with the second side. Here is the opening of 1649. Standing near the stump of Charing Cross, he watched the file of musketeers pressing the crowd back. The crowd was already closely packed. It heaved, tottered, then moved forwards, breaking the line of soldiers. Curses and helpless cries filled the chill air. The soldiers had reformed and were pressing the crowd back again, using their musket butts, but without striking. The heavy silence settled down once more. The trudging of feet, the low but stertorous breathing of thousands in the cold, difficult air, mingled with the slow whine of the falling wind. All made a rustle like the first storm breath in forest leaves, a rustle rising and ebbing but never breaking into the expected storm yell. The sound seemed merely to weave a heavier pall of silence over Whitehall. The command uttered by an unseen officer lost its sharpness. It was muffled at once in the enveloping sough. It failed against the wall of wintry cold, the dull tension of the masses. Echoing in the mind, it seemed almost the cry not of one commanding, but of one lost and begging for help. Cry of a swimmer whose head sank the next moment under the mantled surface of this pool of January silence. "Is the hour fixed?" Ralph Lidcott asked the man next to him. The man turned his head slowly and stared at Ralph, stared with vague eyes of tiredness, then shook his head and turned away again. He had not answered no to the question. He had repudiated the question altogether. He had answered that he didn't know and didn't care. That seemed the attitude of the whole crowd. They stood there without any obvious assent or dissent. They waited, they accepted, they remained silent. They were neither eager nor depressed. They waited. Yes. The building in Whitehall out of which Charles Stept were executed, which the people are gathered round in that account, is actually still there. One of the few bits of old Whitehall which are still in existence. But that, of course, is only the beginning of the passage. It builds up and up and up in that kind of atmosphere. And more I try to get the feeling of a kind of certain automatism, that the thing is happening outside anybody's will, and yet though all the wills are ultimately converging on this point. But I would just like to draw attention to one point in that in there, which strikes me as I read it to be rather characteristic of my method, this use of natural imagery at the background, this kind of comparison of the crowd there waiting to this kind of forest with the wind, the sounds just beginning, but not yet at all determinate. I've always had the feeling, it comes I think from the poetry, a very strong sense of the relationship of man and nature, and this, both in my thought and in my work, has become more and more a key thing, this relation of man alienated from nature, trying to find harmony again with nature, and the way in which this works out in his whole social, personal life, and so on. When I began, of course, I wrote with a pen, mostly writing in very small writing, so I could get a couple of 2,000 or 3,000 words almost on a page. I somehow felt that this helped me to get the pattern of what I was writing more than if I wrote in a large way, and when one didn't seem to have any sense of how much one had covered and where it was all getting to and so on. And then I would type it out perhaps once or twice after correcting it. But I gradually, of course, got more and more used to the typewriter, and this book I've just quoted from was the first book I wrote directly on the typewriter, with very little corrections afterwards. Of course, before I started on it, I'd collected all the material very thoroughly, an immense quantity of notes, had worked out the structure and pattern of what I was going to say, and had thought it over and over, so I had it all very clearly in my mind. And this was the first work, though, in which I did exactly along this way, in which I then started on the typewriter, and only after that only made local corrections. Didn't retype any of it. As I said, I've always tried to get as close to the original sources in anything I'm working with. This applies to literary sources, but also applies, of course, to the actual physical sources. I've always tried to see a place, if it is still in existence in any shape at all relevant to what I was writing about and so on. And as these historical novels, these later ones, almost not all, but mostly about England, I have been able to write about areas which I have gone to look at or have already known quite well. This, for instance, appears strongly in a later historical novel of mine, The Great Oak, which is about the Kett Rebellion in Norfolk in 1549, which is the area covered is area I got to know very well indeed, and so I could write it, although a lot of it has been spoiled since around Norwich. Nevertheless, a great deal of it is still there, and one could really feel oneself in the area. But particularly in the post-war period, though already the seeds were there before, I have expanded my work into all kinds of directions. At first glance, people have often thought that how on earth can anybody cover so many different fields that they seem to be unrelated, and they think that therefore they must be superficial because you can't jump from one thing to another so rapidly and really know what you're writing about. But this is not true from my angle. Although I have developed into all kinds of different areas, fields and methods and so on, they are all, from my point of view, organically related to my fundamental interests, and they all ultimately go back to this very simple matter of poetry, which is ultimately humanity, of course, but in this from a specific angle. I have poetry on the one hand, and then poetry realized through history, as I have in the post-war period written, as I said, in a large number of fields, some of them directly connected with history, direct historical works, which the interest has grown enormously of recent years, so there's a very big public now for history, and I have done quite a lot of works both on English or ancient history, and one on Byzantium, fairly long history of Byzantium, covering, of course, the medieval period too. I've done a certain amount of work on the medieval period, but and of recent years I have concentrated perhaps on Greco-Roman Egypt because of the enormous amount of papyri from there, which enables one to get an insight into life in all kinds of ways and all kinds of levels, as one can't into any other aspect of ancient history, or even, as far as that goes, medieval history almost, because this is the only area and time in which there's an enormous amount of material dealing with personal life, well, every aspect of social, political and personal life, and therefore one has a unique opportunity to study people in an ancient environment in a way that's not possible anywhere else, where you only have general historical works plus archaeology, almost has practically nothing else than that, to fill in the field. And also it has a fascination being a very new field, because it's only really begun since about 1900, so that very few scholars have dared to do more than work in a very specialized, particular way in this field. So I've dashed in where angels fear to tread and written a number of general works on this, and I am continuing on this. The last couple are rather specialized, but nevertheless cover quite big fields in trying to grapple with ancient science. In a few days, my book on the origins of alchemy in Greco-Roman Egypt will appear, and I'm working on one on the origins of astrology at the moment, because as part of this development I was speaking of, this expansion of interest, this effort to understand history in all its forms, I've even gone to the point of a great interest in the history of science. Both these books are very detailed studies of ancient science, and I have done other work too. I've got in the press a book on an edition of Joseph Priestley's memoirs, which is a study of 18th century science, and I published a general critique called Marxism and Contemporary Science, and I intend to do a lot more on this field. I've got a lot of ideas about the developments in physics today and so on. During the post-war period, I was very friendly with L.L. White, who I think is a great scholar on the problems of science, and through him, with some other scientists, I discussed a lot of these things, and for a period was very fascinated and taken up with this. But this is just an example of the various ways in which I have spread my interest, though it always is, from my point of view, the same interest. I've also, this is a more obvious connection, got very interested in archaeology, and when I came down here, where I have been since 1951, partly through a farmer who got very interested in the Roman remains on his lands, and also from an interesting character who lived at Helsted. He's now immigrated to New Zealand, who had acquired, not at all educated man, had acquired a lot of material about the things that had turned up in the fields and so on. I developed as a field archaeologist, and for a period did quite a lot of work in this area and discovered quite a lot of Roman and medieval sites. The medieval sites were nearly all kilns, but very quite important and interesting ones. But I have found quite a lot of Roman sites and material in this area. I just remembered that Professor Mickey, whom I mentioned, when I was leaving the university, gave me a letter of recommendation, which of course I long ago lost, but I can remember he said in it that my strong point was seeing the relationship of things. And this, I think, perhaps was correct, because in my development, insofar as it has any value, is along the lines I've said, in which I have kept on expanding my feeling for things, but at the same time keeping a very definite center in all this. So therefore I feel for this reason I have been able to extend my interest without losing myself in the new fields and new material that's come up, because always there's a fundamental center in this from which I can relate things, and ultimately bring them back. And so I finally come to the point of view of agreeing with Hegel, who said the educated man is the man who can do anything. Another form to which I've turned of recent years is the development of art criticism, not so much in the form of abstract art criticism, but dealing concretely with artists, specific artists, in the form largely of biography. I have done particularly 2 biographies, one of Turner and one of Cézanne, and I have a contract. I haven't got any work on paper yet for it, to do another one on Courbet. The beginning of this was a book I did called Death of the Hero, which is around the poetry of the painting of the French Revolution. The origin of this was, I think it was 49. I was just happened to be in Paris, and there was an exhibition in the Orangerie of the paintings of David, which I knew very little about at that time. I'd just seen the ordinary reproductions of his big neoclassic things. But in this exhibition, there was this very striking contrast between the enormously impressive, large neoclassic paintings, wonderful in draftsmanship, but with an element of coldness, and his portraits, which were the exact opposite, which had great warmth, human feeling, and a number of romantic characteristics which are entirely absent from the neoclassic painting. So this struck me as very interesting. I've got interested in him where I never had been before. Felt there must be an interesting character in this conflict between the human warmth of the portraits and the effort to depict history in a kind of grandiose way in the neoclassic paintings. But this was just at the back of my mind. I didn't do any work. I did collect some material, but I didn't do anything on it. But a friend of mine who knew my interest in this, and who had a job as managing in a publishing firm, who remembered this, said to me, "Why don't you write something about it?" So I thought, why not? So I started on this. I wrote this book, Death of a Hero, which launched me into the field of art criticism, and then led in turn to this Turner, which I particularly found interesting. I'd begun actually doing some work many years ago as part of my work on 18th century poetry. Turner was very keen to be a poet. I just knew this general way, and had collected a few of his poems, and I wrote an article in Life and Letters, which I discussed, I remember, with Edith Sitwell and Sir Kenneth Clarke at the time, but Clarke gave me some advice about it, but I didn't do anything further about it. But then this same friend of mine who'd put me on to doing the David book remembered this and drew my attention to the fact that there was something to follow up here. I did more work on Turner's poetry and discovered, to my intense surprise, how neglected his notebooks in the British Museum, there in the print department there, had been, that they were full of scribblings, and often very difficult indeed to read, both in verse and prose. I told him about this, and he said, "Why not write a life of him and use this?" So I had this astonishing luck of being able to write a life of Turner, drawing on a great deal of new material from his own writings, which until very recently English scholars have hardly looked at or treated with contempt, just saying, "Oh, he wasn't a very good poet," and so on, ignoring the fact that they gave tremendous insight into Turner's mind, the workings of his mind, and so on. But I might perhaps mention here that the Turner book played a very good part in my relations with Turner. I had a period of break with Norman after I wrote my second autobiographical thing, in which called The Roaring Twenties, in which I had made only a very brief comment of the way in which Norman, for a period in the 20s, was very interested in a kind of Ouija board thing. This was absolutely true. I was present at it, and he told me hundreds of times about it, and played a very important part in his life. But for some strange reason, Norman had a very, I don't know what is a guilt sense or what it is about. He hated any reference to this in public anyway. He quarrelled with Lionel, who had been his bosom friend, because Lionel made some rude remarks about his activities in this respect. And I got a letter from him, to my great surprise, saying, I see from reviews, he hadn't read the book, that you have stigmatized me as a spiritualist. Stigmatized is a great word of Norman's, and I don't want anything more to do with you. So I wrote back saying, but this is ridiculous. I have only stated what are the absolute facts, and very briefly, how can you object to this? There had been one or two other things in the book which I thought he mightn't like, but it never struck me that this was going to upset him so much. So anyway, for a few years, our relationship completely lapsed. And then my friend Harry Chaplin, who'd been up to see him, wrote and said, I really think Norman would like to resume contact with you. Just send him along the Turner book. I'm sure that would please him. So I sent him the Turner book without any reference to our break, and to my pleasure got back a letter from him saying how tremendously he liked it and so on, without any reference at all to this break over this accusation of being a spiritualist. But so anyway, the Turner book did bring us together again, and I was very pleased that Norman liked it, because Turner, of course, was one of his great gods, and he therefore it did mean quite a lot to him. One other line which has come out of my own poetry has been the translation of poetry, because this is already mentioned in relation to the Greeks, but I did quite a lot of Greek poetry, and Lysistrata particularly played an important part in my life. The Theocritus, many other poets I've done, but not Roman poets too. But from this has developed quite an extensive line of translating poetry, both of Latin medieval poetry, the poetry of the early Dark Ages, and then of the later Latin medieval poetry, which I've published a book of and done quite a lot. But I've also translated from many other languages. I have the capacity to pick up a language very quickly from the point of view of reading and particularly of translating poetry. I have, for instance, even briefly learnt Romanian. I translated a number of poems and published them. I have published translations not only from French and languages like that, but quite a fair-sized book, and a smaller one, of contemporary Russian poetry. Although my Russian is very bad, at moments I have worked it up. It goes back originally to 1918. When I was in Brisbane, I started learning it and were able to read Pushkin. But Russian is a language you have to keep reading if you want to keep it up. One forgets the vocabulary is difficult, and so on. I intend actually soon to, last year I read quite a lot of Russian poetry, the very recent Russian poetry with some Russian, and there's some very good poetry, and I want to work further on that. I've done quite a lot of Provençal poetry, Greek medieval poetry, and so on. I've even done some Polish poetry, working with a Pole. But that has been one of the main lines in which I've kept my poetry going. Of recent years, I haven't written a great deal of poetry for myself. I did, in the immediate post-war period, do a certain amount, and I also wrote, for instance, a form which practically nobody else, I think, has developed in England except myself, mass declamations, which were done for groups, voices, and balletic movement, and so on. During the war, I was in by sheer luck, I spent the second part of the war in the War Office, in the ABCA, as the scriptwriter for the ABCA play unit, in which we used verse. I used verse for the more intense moments. These were plays done entirely for the army, and one had to do this very tactfully in order to we used this in order to get intense emotion at certain points and so on. So I have used it in other aspects in the theatre, though I've never done much in the theatre, because it's a field in which you have to really give us up more or less entirely to if you want to do anything effective in it. 2 years ago I did 4 plays of Euripides for Bernard Miles, an old close friend of mine, at the Mermaid, and I probably will be doing further work along this line for him. Recently, I think it's only in the writing dedications to books that I have done much writing of poetry. Perhaps I would like to read one, though this is not such a recent one, but it is the dedication to the book in which I have already drawn a fair amount of attention, 1649. The person to whom it's addressed, I should make a few remarks about to make the poem fully understandable, is a chap called Marley Denwood, a very interesting Cumbrian character who had got in touch with me about various things. He belonged to a kind of a family of folk poets. His father had been a village tailor. They still existed in the 1890s and the early part of the century. He was also a poet, and he was continually poaching and getting put into Carlisle jail, and he used to keep the family by writing attacks on the riverboard and so on, which are printed as broadsheets. He was quite a good folk poet, And he had a set of very talented sons, which one was Marley Denwood, another one Jonathan Denwood, who was, I think, really the first good folk poet surviving in England, and so on. So this is the background of this poem, which one has to understand in order to, I think, get the feeling of what I've tried to put into it. But because the Denwoods were very much an English family, very rooted in the English earth, this Cumbrian earth, he and his the various brothers did quite a lot of work on Cumbrian dialects and so on, that I felt he was the right kind of person to dedicate this book to, which tried to get something very English in it. Right. Windy across the rippled gold of wheat, or crunching through the silver fields of frost, the years go by us, friend, and we together lean on the gate, and speaking of old harvests wrung bravely from the earth, discern above our chiming voices echoes of the future. These men that strode the England of our past, these sturdy men that drove their furrow straight, fight at our side today. We call them up against the time of agues. We go down, but hear the shout of young men coming after, and are content. There's fight in the old dog yet, but the hearth silence seethes with memories. There's comfort in our talk, our looking back on dwindled valleys. Have we come so far? Breathing the harsh air, thinking of the dead, we earn the murmuring hush by the meadow gate, licking our wounds with talk. We spin our yarns between the harvests. Call your father up, poet and poacher, treadling his sewing machine, until the whirring throbbed into a song. The grave of poverty and pain had claimed him before the worms. But like his whiplash broadsheets, he nailed his name on the forbidding doors. Call him, and with him, Chartists, true hearts all, call all the yeoman stock from which you spring, out of the loins of Cumberland. For they will rise to hear this tale. They are part of it. Call up your brother Jonathan. Call up his boisterous laugh of strength, his moorland craft. Call him up in his youth, before they harried him as they have harried you and the others. Call Jonathan with his splendid powers of song, and leave the embittered voices of his death. He too must hear the tale we have to tell. We that love England have our pride in her. Aye, love of England is the tale we tell. We mix with her in toil. The softening greys bind all the sweeping greens of buxom summer, or gaunt the tree of winter claws the clouds. We dream a moment between swathe and swathe, or stand in rooted endurance who are England. You Denwoods are the fighting stock, I mean, and here's the tale. So I think I can claim that despite the considerable differences in the things I've done, there is this element of continuity, this kind of centre, which is on the one hand poetry, and on the other hand is humanity, because poetry, I've always put it in different ways at different times, I've always felt as the kind of essence of human experience, and therefore it's something which is both timeless and very deeply rooted in time, which gives you something which persists in mankind insofar as mankind is really human and struggling to be more human, and at the same time is giving you some particular reaction in time and space. And there's this, so to speak, dialectic between universality and timelessness and immediacy of time, which has always fascinated me, and which has, as I've tried to say, links together all my various interests. And one of the reasons I think why I've turned so much to these Greco-Roman Egypt is because one has these actual documents. In reading these often illiterate, clumsy documents of people in various difficulties and so on, personal business and all the rest of it, you can get an immediate feeling of the people in the ancient world as you can't from any generalized history. And as part of this development, which I've tried to sketch, I've always very much wanted to have roots. Perhaps this has its background, my Australianism, with very little roots, at the same time with an interest in history, always trying to find something where one could drive one's roots in and feel, build one's life around this and grasp the actual local development, local history. And until I settled here in Castle Hedingham, I had moved an extraordinary amount around England, but almost if I stayed anywhere, if I stayed more than a few weeks, I'd start trying to learn something about the ancient history, something, the local history, something about the people in the area and so on. But I would be very happy by a series of chances to settle here in Castle Hedingham in North Essex. It's really part of East Anglia on the Suffolk border, in an old house, which is a 15th, 16th century house at basis. It appears in the, one can see it in the map, which was drawn up by the, in about 1590 of the village. It is the village where the Earls of Oxford lived, and we actually have a castle here. The house itself has a strange name of Bankslap, so I've never been able to find out how it came. I occasionally get addresses from abroad, letters addressed to Jack Lindsay, Castle, Bankslap's Castle, Hedingham. Bankslap's is not exactly a castle, but it has the basis of an old Tudor or late medieval house, and this makes me happy. I've done various things to it, of course, but nevertheless tried to keep the original character.